wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah rabbil alamin, wabihi nasta'in ala umuri dunya waddin, wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'du. Rabbi syrah li sadri wa yassir li amri, wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Our respected guru and mentor, Professor Dr. Mansur Ibrahim from International Center for Education in Islamic Finance in SIF, Malaysia, representative from our co-organizers, representative from UIN Syarif Hidayatullah Jakarta, from University of Indonesia, from IPB University, as well as IAEI Jakarta chapter, and all the participants, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, let us praise Allah the Almighty, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, for His immeasurable grace and blessings upon us. So we, Alhamdulillah, can gather virtually in this important occasion. Second, peace be upon the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, our greatest role model of all time. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the executive management of KNIKS, I would like to thank everyone, all of you, for being here with us today, this morning, in this international workshop series, session 7. And we would like to extend our highest gratitude to our mentor, our research mentor, our guru, Professor Mansur Ibrahim, for sparing his time and knowledge to be with us at this important workshop. Jazakumullah khair. We also would like to thank our co-organizers, because without their support and help, we will not be able to conduct this event. And of course, to all participants who are still active. I know that, like in any competition, in any big games, when it reaches semi-final, the number of participants will be less than the beginning phase in the group stage. So those who are still active, those who are still attending the workshop, they are already semi-finalists. So you are selected among the best. Don't really think about why the number of participants is getting less, because they don't use this opportunity, properly, wisely. It is a very big opportunity to get the lesson directly from the expert. However, some do not think this as opportunity. May Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala always grant us good health, prosperity in the years and in the years to come, and also during this pandemic time. Ladies and gentlemen, we are already in the 7th series, as we mentioned before. In this series, we are going to discuss about organizing robustness tests and strategizing robustness check. For all selected participants, I would like to urge all of you to use again this opportunity to learn as much as possible from Professor Mansur. We do ask your full commitment again to do your best during this session, which include doing the tasks or homework given by Professor Mansur. Lastly, I would like to call and to urge all of you to be active during the workshop, and again, to use this opportunity wisely. May Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala bless all of us. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for your speech, Dr. Emir. Dr. Sultan Emir. Even though it's a little, we will get a big impact, and those who have not been able to come, maybe he can watch what YouTube or recording to improve their paper. Okay, next agenda is session 1, organizing robustness test. The mentor is Prof. Mansur Ibrahim. I will read Prof. Mansur Ibrahim brief profile. Prof. Mansur Ibrahim is currently a professor and deputy president academic and dean at the International Center for Education in Islamic Finance, INSIF, Malaysia. He received his PhD in economics in 1996 from Washington University. His area of interest include monetary, macroeconomic, economic development, financial market analysis, Islamic banking and finance, and applied econometric. In 2020, Prof. Mansur Ibrahim was ranked top 2% world in scientific in the field of economic based on University Stanford related to Scopus Citation Rank 2019. Was editor on World Economic Journal and Pacific Basin Finance Journal, Association editor and Journal Economic Modeling, and have a Scopus High Index International more than 20. Okay. Okay. I will call our mentor and guru, Prof. Mansur Ibrahim. Time is yours in session 1.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thanks, Dini and Dr. Emir and representative from all partnering institutions. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
We have gone through 6 workshops. We have done 6 workshops, and now in our 7th workshops, right? And we started early of the years. I forgot which months, but not so early of the years, but then towards I think 4th or 5th months, right? And now we are in month number 10, and we are going to have 1 more month to go for our workshops, right? And I think that you may realize, I'm not sure, should I put the difficulty or the hardships, right, in writing, right, or in conducting research, right? But in fact, right, it's not the difficulty or the hardship, but because this is the first time we go through the workshops. I think you may have gone through workshop before, but I do not remember a type of workshop that are really extensive. Go part by parts for the writing and articles, right? So these are really extensive workshop that we have gone through. We have 10 series, try to look at different portions of the articles, right? And the really important part that we have to remember that when we conduct research, right, really important that we have to remember is that we try to learn and we try to gain knowledge of certain things that we are not sure, right? We are not sure, and we try to answer. And we get some answers from what people have done before, but there are certain things that we would like to add in and bring into the discussions, right? Very important part, right? I give you very simple examples. I think Sulaiman is writing on financial inclusions and growth. There are many work that has been done, but then he would like to know, for example, what would be the impact of digital financial inclusions? And digital is a new thing coming up. We know financial inclusions in the context of bank branching, in the context of ATMs availability, in the context of number of people that use bank accounts and so on, right? But then not so much in the context of digitalizations or digital banking. So he would like to know, So it's basically the drive, right? For us to do research is the urge to get knowledge. We would like to get knowledge in order to conduct research. And for us to be able to get knowledge, we have to go through a rigorous way or a rigorous path. We cannot just go and see and just come up with the conclusions, right? We have to be rigorous in our analysis so that when we get the results, we are convinced with the results and we are comfortable to inform our results to others or to use the result as inputs into the policies, right? And in order to be convinced, basically, apart from what we have done before on how we convey, how we try to convince people in introductions with the significance of the work, and we properly put our work within the literature, and we come up with a basic frameworks or the models for us to address whatever we try to know, right? The most important part for us to be convinced is that our results that we try to convey must stand robustness checks, right? Which means that the results themselves must be robust, right? If, for example, right, we run one estimations or we perform one analysis and the results support certain hypotheses, but if we change our framework a little bit, right? If the result change, for example, then the results depends on the way you do things, right? But if the results do not change according to different way of you doing things, then the result is considered to be robust. And in that way, you'll be more convinced with your own results, right? And basically, a kind of our, I would say in terms, these are very important because it related to ethics. For us to be able to inform others of the knowledge that we have uncovered, we have to be convinced, which means we know exactly this is the right one, right? Or we have high confidence that what we have found out is basically the knowledge that we have uncovered from our research. We cannot just go and tell people something we are not sure, right? You don't disseminate something that we are not sure in terms of knowledge, right? So that's why we need to do robustness checks. And robustness checks is very important elements in the good research work, right? Because if you try to publish your work without robustness checks, right, you will not get accepted. Normally, examiners will look at how robust your results is, right? So that's why we dedicate one session here to look at strategies on and try to learn on how people do robustness checks, right? So let me share with you my screen. I think Nadia have sent this to the groups, right? To all of you. Right? So let me share this and I will go through robustness checks, our result and interpretations part 2, right? So that's what we try to do, and we focus specifically on robustness checks. And then hopefully we have some time so that I can pick up what you have done in terms of the methods that you have proposed, and try to think together on how we should proceed with robustness checks, right? And some note first. Now, as I mentioned in the part 1, the presentations on result and interpretation is for empirical papers. It's more specific, those who apply regressions or econometric models to look at the relationship between the variables, right? Some have looked at determinants of digital adoptions, right? Some try to look at the impact of certain variables on Islamic banking performance. Some try to look at, as I mentioned before, the impact of digital financial inclusions on economic growth, right? And they apply econometric models, right? There are few articles where I will try to look at later on that use different framework, right? But still, I would say that this session will benefit even if you do not use regressions or econometric models, right? But you use different quantitative techniques, because when it comes to quantitative techniques, there are principles, there are foundations which are the same, right? And always good papers do not have only one table of results, meaning that you are going to have many tables, right? Where those many tables includes your first tables, what normally put them as baseline results or basic results, and then contain many tables of robustness checks, right? So this part two, as I mentioned, we try to discuss organizations of tables. Right? Of course, before we can organize them, we have to make decisions on how we should conduct robustness checks. And that's the strategies that we'll try to learn here, right? On how to conduct robustness checks. And then the example of discussions of results, right? So in doing this, what I'm going to go through is basically to go to four different, I have four different topics that we'll discuss, where topic number 3 will take most of our time here. How to conduct robustness checks. What are the hints that need to be put in there, right? But before I go to the number 3, which is our main topics, right? Our main focus for today's discussions, right? I will look into just why you peek a little bit, just look at the submission that has been made for task number 3, the empirical methods, and try to not to give the full feedback, but just to give general overview and little bit of comments on what has been submitted in context of empirical methods, right? And then I will give you examples. Of course, there are so many examples in the journal, but I will pick up 2 examples, right, from 2021. The articles that I'm reading right now try to look at the impact of uncertainty, because we have all kinds of uncertainty that have taken place over the past many years. Right? We have Asian financial crisis, we have global financial crisis, we have dot-com bubbles, we have Russian crisis, we have European sovereign debt crisis, right? And you have global financial crisis, and we have trade war between China and US, right? We have Brexit. All those things create all kinds of uncertainties. And to add, we have the pandemic now, right? Which create uncertainty. So I'm reading article on uncertainties. I will give few examples that I have read, and I will show you basically how extensive they have done in their work, right? And these are the expectations of the good journals, right? Before I go to robustness checks. And then I will discuss finally, of course, my suggested structure and discussions of the results, right? I will not be as in the introduction literature review. There are many different ways you can structure them, right? But then I will give you one basic structure that normally used in the journal articles. So these are basically the contents, right, of my discussion today. Right now, if you take a look at the submission that has been made, right? If you have submitted, for example, but then your paper numbers not indicated here, right? Then please inform me, or maybe you can resend back, because every time you submit, I download and I put in my own drive, right? And I keep track of what people have submitted, because at the end, once the full paper coming in, then we can do enhancements of the articles by looking at various parts and try to put them together in a more coherent manner, right? So the context of submissions that I have, right? When I look at the methods that have been mentioned, right? As what I say here, there are 3. I can classify the methods into 3, and the first one, the one that use secondary data, and all of these one they use panel data, right? So which means they have both cross-sectional unit, and they have the time series mentions. certain article use bank level data set, certain article they use country level data set. Okay. Now, and these are paper number 17, 19, and 39. I forgot which is which, but then they look into technology diffusions, right? Which is what affect the adoptions of technology by banks, right? And the sample Indonesian banking sector, right? And the second one look at basically banking performance and what are determinants of banking performance and evaluate various aspects of bank performance, including one important aspect, innovations. Right? So that's one, right? And the other one try to look at the impact of digital financial inclusions on economic growth, right? And 5 articles use survey data, and 3 of them, 47, 58, and 69, provide the framework, right? And estimates basically and use the data that have been compiled, because this is related to survey data that you evaluate intention to adopt, for example, cash wakaf, right? Intentions for using or adoption or using halal cosmetics. So those are various type of topics for group number 2. And all of this that use survey data, when they suggested the framework, the author suggests structural equation modeling, PLS-SEM, or partial least square structural equation modeling. And there are 2 articles not indicated the method. So these 2, 43, 63, you have to look carefully, you have to look back and then come up with the methods that you would like to use. Right? When method means a framework for you to test the hypothesis, it's not enough just to basically indicate these are my data, these are my dependent variables, and these are my other variables that I have constructed from the data, but then you do not specify in what ways you are going to link them together, right? Whether through regressions or through structural equation modeling, right? And other methods, right, other than this, for example, one article try to look at the mandatory spin-off, right, of banks, right, and using ARIMA, the auto-regressive integrated moving average frameworks. So I'm not sure that in this case, but I have to look into more detail a little bit on how ARIMA is used, whether this framework, right, is basically able, for example, to address the objective that has been stated, right? And there are one more work that try to look at, I forgot, paper 46, apply analysis of variance, try to look at independence, right? And again, in terms of using analysis of variance, is this sufficient, right? Because to look at independence, right, or dependence of 2 characteristics, maybe more need to be done than analysis of variance, right? So these are the work and the method that has been suggested. Now, as I mentioned, the discussions that I would like to give you here will be based on using standard econometrics models, which means more or less it will heavily depends on the group number 1, others that use cross-sectional data set, or even to a certain extent time series data set, right? But however, I should mention to you that the guidelines for robustness check, the guideline for many aspects that I'm going to discuss here, will generally be applicable for survey data and time series data too. They will be applicable, right? Because and again, if you have time and you would like to ask, for example, in the context of especially time series data, they do robustness checks too, but then not as extensive as secondary data, because the way that we approach the analysis is different in context of panel and time series data, right? And in terms of structural equation modeling, I'm not sure in terms of this case because I myself not aware of structural equation modeling, but as I mentioned, certain aspects that I'm going to discuss, I think would be good if you can adopt them for robustness checks when you do, when you, for example, estimate the models or the structural equations models, right, when you perform the estimations, right? So these are basically the method has been basically submitted. Of course, there are few things. The writing still need to be improved in the contact methods and so on. As I mentioned, I will wait until the article takes shapes, right? When the article takes shape and so on, and then we can do the enhancements of the articles, right? Based on what you have written, right? So these are basically task number 3 that I have given, right? And of course, task number 4 would be basically after this, right? For you to look into your own methods, right? And then from that own method, suggest what are the baseline or the basic or the first results that you would like to report. And then discuss a little bit the tables that come afterwards, right? Robustness checks. Right? How would you perform robustness checks if applicable, right? Because some study that look at, let's say, opinions and so on. Of course, in that context, you may not be able to do robustness checks, right? And even in context survey data, maybe limited robustness checks, right? But then try to look at the hints that I would like to provide you in today's sessions, right? I would like to provide you today's sessions, certain hints. Take a look at, and maybe you can apply to your survey data analysis, right? That you have done to address certain objective, right? Now, I will give you first some articles that I have just read, very new articles, right? And these articles, the first one, right, coming from the applied economics, right? Because what motivated me to search for these articles, just to basically share with you, in case, for example, if you can get data from Indonesian banking, for example, right? Indonesian banking at the bank level data set, because I'm not sure whether you have that detailed data or not, right? But you know more in the context of database that Indonesian bank has, right? What I try to do here, because I've read few articles that have looked at Islamic financings, and our understanding right now is basically Islamic financing is skewed toward murabahah contract or debt-like contracts, sale-based, right? Not equity-based like mudarabah or musyarakah, right? And a lot of people have used that conditions to basically questions the Islamic banks, whether Islamic bank is really Islamic or not. But then my interest is different, right? And in 2006, right, Agarwal and Yusuf said that why Islamic banks have less equity-based financing is because of agency problems, right? Substantial moral hazards and so on, right? And the other work that coming up in 20, I'm not mistaken, 18 in the world economy, for example, in the journal article where I guess edited that article, there's one theoretical article coming up that said that the adoptions of mudarabah or musyarakah financings is driven by the contractual environments, right? Or the economic environments, whether the borrowers, for example, those who ask for financing, are certain of are more certain of the profitability of the projects or not, right? So it's basically, when I look at those things, it tend to be linked to uncertainty, right? Because when you have higher level of uncertainty, right, moral hazard will be more severe, right? And agency problems will be more severe during the period of high uncertainty. And during the period of high uncertainty, we become less sure of whether the project will work or not, right? So if that is the case, it may affect the way that bank, right, the way that bank allocates their sources of fund to different type of contracts, right? To different type of contracts. If really the musyarakah or mudarabah financing, for example, the mudarabah musyarakah financing is subject to moral hazard problems, right? Is subject to uncertainty, then uncertainty would be a potential determinant of musyarakah financing. So I searched for these articles by Mohapatra. I got this article that looked at uncertainty and bank loan portfolios. What they did is basically try to look at how economic uncertainty affects lending to households, right? Now, when I look at this thing and try to understand the framework and so on, so I think to myself, this can be applied, right, by looking at how economic uncertainty affects, right, bank financing in the form of equity-based financing, mudarabah and masyarakat. And the only thing is kind of change the focus a little bit, right? In terms of this article, they look at business loan, they look at consumer loans and other type of loans, right? But when we look at Islamic banking, I believe that we can use the same framework and try to look at allocations, right? The allocations of deposits or financial resources to equity-based financing and sale-based financing. So that's what I try to do, and that's why I collect this article. And in fact, if, for example, you get details, right? Detailed data by contracts, you can do exactly the same thing, because I observed that 2 or 3 articles now look at the determinants of different type of financing for us to be really able to understand, why this thing happened, the phenomenon of low adoptions of equity financing, right? So that's why I searched for these articles, right? And then the second article, more or less the same, try to look at uncertainty that are driven by policy, right? And how it affects financial soundness. So let me share what they have done in these 2 articles, right? And in the context of presentations of results, right? Now, the first article you look at what they have done, and these are the first table of the results, right? Which you can see clearly what they have done, right? In the context of the first table of results. They present 3 regressions in the first tables. And these are the key variables. Right? They look at economic policy uncertainty, and they try to look at how this economic policy uncertainty affect the proportions or the household credit or lending to the households divided by total loans, right? So they try to look at those things, and they evaluate how this EPU affect this. And they present 3 regressions, right? And this is what they term as baseline models. So normally, right, when we do regression analysis, we start with the baseline, and normally the baseline estimated using we present it in many regressions, right? And in this article, 3 regressions has been provided. And you notice what is the main difference between these 3, right? If you look at very simple, the main difference between these 3 is the control variables. All other variables, EPU, appear in all 3 regressions, 1, 2, 3. But then in the first regressions, they only add bank level variables. In the second regressions, they only add country level variable like GDP growth, private credits, right? And all other variable in there. And in the third regressions, they add both. Right? So this is what they term as baseline regressions. And normally we have to think when we try to basically come up with the results, because normally before discussion of result, it's good to strategize first and put result in tables. And once we have all the results, then we sit down and think on how to write and convey our results in our articles, right? Now, if you look in this case, there are 3, right? In the context of the baseline result that has been presented. Now, just to show you how extensive they have been, right, in context of robustness checks that we look at. They do roughly 10 robustness checks. I presented some of them here, right? And if you look at they do all kind of robustness checks, right? The first one, if you look at, they use different measures of economic uncertainty, right? Second ones, right, they use alternative samples, what they have done in that article, what they have international data set, right? So, and bank level data set. And for the United States, rather than including all banks, they apply certain criteria first. So they do not want to put all US bank. So his sample or their samples, right, have US bank, but certain banks only. But then they do alternative tests, right? Do the regressions. Right? They perform the regressions, right? And when they perform the regressions, they do to include all US bank without screening any bank out. And then the second one, they exclude all US bank because afraid that US bank would drive the whole thing. Because US bank, they are big and there are many, right? So that's what they have, alternative samples. And if you look at here, basic model, they use lag one. Now, in robustness check, they try to look at what happened if I use lag two, what happened if I use lag four, right? They control for more independent variables. Right? They use different dependent variables. They split the samples according to trade credit utilizations, right? And in the model that they use US, the bank level data set, but in robustness checks, they also use country level data set. And you look at how extensive this is, right? You have basically the basic regressions. Now, they subject the same regression, they perform the same regressions, but with all these different criteria put in. The idea, they want to know how robust the result would be. Right? If I delete US bank, what would happen? Right? If I do the country level, use country level data instead of bank level data set, what would happen? Right? So these are the extensiveness that has been done in the article in order to perform robustness checks. Right? And the second articles, if you look at, just to give you, right, second articles, when we look at here, again, these are the baseline results that has been presented, and this is the one that I shared with you in the last workshops, the baseline result. If you look at what are the difference between them, right? 1, 2, 3, right? The difference between them is basically the independent variable 1, 2, 3, 4. The independent variables. Right? You look at here, only put CPU in. Here they add in some other variables. And here they add in different independent variables. And number 4, they put all together. And number 5, number 6, different in the context of how they control the country effect and the year effect. They use panel data. Right? So you look at these are baseline results. Normally, baseline result will not be one regressions. There should be more than one regressions. Of course, there are many different ways to present the baseline result, not just according to different set of independent variables that you notice in the context of many articles that you have read. For example, you should look at how they present the first results. Right? Most of them they present in this way, which means that many regressions differentiated by the set of independent variables as the first regressions results. Okay? So that's what they have done. Now let's take a look at how this article performed robustness checks. Right? For us to appreciate how extensive the way that they have done things. Right? And these are things that we have to learn from the articles that has been published. Because when you read this type of article, you feel that you know something, a little bit more. Right? Because this article have given you very convincing evidence regarding the objective they try to address or hypothesis that they have set. Right? So how they do robustness check in terms of this case? Right? Now, if you take a look at how they do robustness checks, right? The baseline models they use, right? The baseline model that they use country levels. Right? Now they go to bank level data set. So which means that they have they have 23 countries in their samples, right? So in the baseline analysis, data by country, right? So country number 1 and all the variables. But then in robustness checks, they compile data at the bank levels, which means bank one in country one, bank two in country one, and bank one in country two, and so on. So they go to the bank level data set. So they have two different data sets, country level and bank level data set, and they re-estimate the models, right? And the same thing, they use national logarithm, the dependent variable. These are different measures of the dependent variables. They include global financial crisis, control for additional independent variables. And number 4 here, very interesting, you look at what they have done here, right? They have 23 countries. So what they did in terms of this case, they dropped one country in turn and forming 23 subsamples, right? What it means in this case, they have 23 countries, they drop country number 1, and that one becomes the first samples, right? And then they take that 23 countries, drop country number 2, and that the second sample. Drop country number 3, the third sample. This is what we term as jackknife regressions. I will discuss a little bit in terms of jackknife regressions, but this is what they have done, drop one country at a time and re-estimate the whole thing. We look at 23 countries. So they have 23 samples and they redo it again, right? So these are basically the one that they have done in context of try to look at try to evaluate the evidence of the baseline result in many different ways, because at the end they want to know whether the results are affected by a country that you put into the sample or not, right? Very important parts, right? Because you do not want your result to be driven by a specific aspect of your data set, right? So that's what they have done in terms of constructing the samples. And then they also look in the context of the assumption that has been made, because normally when we run regressions, our main assumption is exogeneity, right? Which means that our independent variable is weakly exogenous, right? They relax that assumptions, and then incorporate endogeneity in and employ different estimation methods, right? So these are the extensiveness of robustness checks, right? So that's why from the beginning, right, before you present the results, you have to sit down first, right? See, being a researcher, right, every point that you are at, right, you have to sit down and strategize. We have discussed in the context of introductions, right? How should we strategize? How should we get information so that later on we can put those information together and build up our arguments why this topic is so important for us to look at. When it comes to literature review, you have to list down your literature review first. You have to jot down certain points first, and you have to look at that literature review and strategize on how to basically organize them. Which one comes first? In what way you would like to organize them? And the same thing in the context of methods and so on. So every aspect you have to strategize. The same thing in the context of results, right? Because result is not only one result, but you have results and robustness checks of the results. So you have many different type of results. So you have to strategize first. And that's why very important for us to know how people strategize on robustness checks, right? Now, I have basically learned this through reading, in fact, right? Through reading, because every time I want to do robustness check, I read few articles, right? Few 20 articles, and try to list down on how they conduct robustness checks, right? That's what I try to learn from them, right? And from time to time, right, I get certain understanding that I would like to share with you here in the context of robustness checks. Right? And of course, I'm not sure whether people write a chapter in the book regarding the way to conduct robustness checks or not. I have not found them, and that's why I learn on my own and try to read articles. And now I have some understanding of how to conduct robustness check, and I would like to share with you here in terms of many different ways that we can do robustness checks, right? But the only thing that we would like to advise you, right? Robustness checks is not for the sake of doing robustness check. You have to have reasons, right? Why you do different way in order to evaluate your baseline regressions, right? You have the baseline results, right? And you, based on the baseline result, you come up with certain conclusions, right? Certain conclusion from your baseline result. You get your initial findings. Now, you want to reassess that initial findings, or you want to extend it or reassess the initial finding. Now, how to reassess? Of course, in order to reassess, you cannot do the same thing. You have to do a different way, right? And that quote unquote different ways must have reason behind it, right? Not just, okay, I do this, now I will do a different way and try to look at the result, but I do not know for sure why I do this different way. You have to have the reasons, right? And it is true for all sections that we have discussed. Whatever we do in our research, we have to have reasons. And the reasons must be basically justifiable, right? Why we do the way we do things, right? Now, when I look at many articles that I have read, right, and try to understand how they do robustness checks, right, I can divide robustness checks into 4 different big themes, main themes, right? 4 different main themes, right? And these 4 different main themes, right, I divide them according to specifications, and I will discuss one by one with you, right? Specifications, measurements, right? Specifications and measurements, and then samples, right? And then estimation methods. We'll go into more details because, as I mentioned, what I have discussed before, just to give you some idea of articles that has been published in Q1 journals, right? Because those are more or less Q1 or Q2 journals. Those articles that has been published there, how robustness their analysis is, right? So that's why I would like to share with you by giving you that examples, right? Now, the main thing that I would try to bring here is that, right, how would you, right? You have to ask yourself, you have your baseline results, right? You have your baseline results, okay? Now, let's say, just give you examples, right? The baseline result tells me that digital financial inclusions affect growth positively. That's your baseline results, right? And you try to look at, you try to explain and give justification for your result and so on. That your baseline results, right? And let's say your baseline result also tell you that diversifications into different type of financing can increase bank stability. So that your baseline result that you get, right? And many others that you have done. For examples, I think the one that look at cash wakaf, for example, you come up with literacy index, right? And you look at basically the financial literacy, which unfortunately, even at the global level, is still low, right? Can motivate the literacy regarding the wakaf, for example, can motivate people to adopt cash wakaf, right? Let's say that is your baseline results, right? Now, when you get that result from the baseline models, which is the one that we discussed in the last workshop, you have to sit down and ask yourself, how would you, right? So which means that you have to be in a different hat, in the sense that now you become the critique of your own work, right? And if you are not able to criticize your own work because you think that this is my work, okay? Now, you have to put yourself in other people's shoes, right? By asking, how would others that read my article here and see my results, the baseline results here, right? Challenge the baseline model and results. How would others criticize my baseline models and baseline result? You have to think that way, right? Because if you look at, right, if you look at one guideline that I would like to provide you here, when you do literature review, right, there are so many uncertainties that you face when you try to write your models, right? I give you a simple example, especially the one that use panel data. or even the one that use basically structure equation modeling. How many constructs that you need to put in, right? How many constructs, right? How many instruments that you need to put in and try to link them? 3, 4, 5. That one, the uncertainty that you observe. Right? Some use 3, some use 4, and try to link here and there in one diagram, for examples. When it comes to regressions, for examples, right? You face a lot of dilemma, in fact, right? When you try to construct your own models. You read the literature, you see one person use dynamic panel, the other person use static panel. And that one's lead to make you to, when you face that situations, you have to make decisions. Right? Which one that you are going to start with, right? Or which one that you are going to adopt and which one you are going to ignore, or would you adopt both of them? But then even if you decide to adopt both of them, which one you are going to start with, right? So when you read your article, you have all kinds of uncertainties, right? Worse yet, when you look at the list of independent variables, right? You read 10 articles, all 10 not exactly the same independent variables. There are few that are the same, but many others, they are not the same. Again, confusions. Which one that I should put in my model, for example, right? So those are uncertainties that you have to jot down, because that uncertainties are not the weaknesses. Those uncertainties are your opportunities to do robustness checks, right? They provide you opportunity, right? So that's basically what you have to look at. Estimation method, right? Some use, there are so many estimation methods. Some use, for example, when it comes to, let's say, the time series, right? One article use ARIMA. The other article may use different type of modeling, right? Error correction modeling. The other article may add in nonlinearity in there, right? And they may have different independent variables. So there are so many different things that can cause confusions, right? But that confusion is not the weakness, right, of what has been published so far. But that confusion provides us opportunity on how to strategize robustness checks, right? Because there are so many estimation methods, right? Or even the model that can be used, right? For example, I try to look at the impact of capital regulations on banking performance. I can use simple static regressions and estimate them, or I can use dynamic, or I can use panel VAR, right? So these are many different type of things that are out there, right? And you look at different people adopt different techniques, right? And read carefully why they adopt them and so on. But at the end, as what we have discussed before, you have to start with some regression first. You have to start with baseline model first, right? So you have to strategize what should be your baseline models, and then what should be the robustness checks. And that's what we try to do here, right? So it's basically you have to sit down, right? First, of course, you already have your objective. Now I would like to present my results here. I have all my data set collected, right, ready to estimate, but don't go just estimate them. Strategize first, right? So be systematic in your analysis. Look at, right? I have my main models, but and have written the model. Maybe I have to go back and rewrite back to basically be in line with the way that I would like to discuss the result and so on. And that's why you have to basically strategize first. And these are 4 different ways of strategizing where I would like to go into details one by one. Okay? Hopefully in the first half, we can finish, I would say 3 of them, and then come back and continue, and then look at the examples. Right? I look at example by picking up one of the articles or I just invite some of you to present your empirical frameworks that you have written. And then from there, let's discuss together in the context of how should we present the baseline, right? How to choose the baseline and how to do robustness checks. Right? Now, I give you these 4 because so far I have not seen more than these 4 different themes under robustness checks, right? Because under these 4, people may ask you, right? people may query what you have done. For example, specifications. People may say, your results may depend on model specifications, right? Whatever adopted by you. Like, let's say you adopt static panel, right? You adopt static panel. People may say, you get that result because you use static panels. But then I think static panel may not be, it's acceptable, but then a better way. Some people may have that opinions, right? So you have to think of, you have to go into the mind of the referees, the mind of others. People may think differently. Right? People may not, of course, you try to convince them these are the right method to start with, but then people may think differently. People may say that, okay, you use that models. No, it might be a different model specification that is needed. It's a better way to do things. Right? And one article, you use ARIMA, for example, but then someone said, no, ARIMA is just time series that look at the past pattern in data. Right? You cannot use time series framework. You have to use time series econometric, which means you have to add more independent variables. Some may have that type of opinions, right? So your specifications, people may ask, your result may depend on model specifications, right? So if you have the reasons, you have to tell them that my result doesn't depend on model specifications. And that's what I mean by robustness checks, right? And the second theme, measurements, the way you measure your variables, right? Your result may depend on the measure that you use, right? How do you measure digital financial inclusions, right? How do you measure intentions to adopt cash wakaf? How do you measure from the construct that you have compiled, right? The use of, let's say, the purchase of halal cosmetics, right? So there are many different ways. How the measurements, people may go and look at the measurements, right? And a lot, bank stability, for example, measurements. Right? Your result may depend on the sample you use, right? You use a sample from Indonesia, okay? If you're focused on Indonesia, we cannot basically do much because that your focus, right, on Indonesian banking, right? But then even that, for example, it depends on the banks that you have included or the firm that you have included, right? It may depend on the sample that you have constructed, right? You may have put some banks or some firms in your data set or some individuals in your data set that might affect the results. And these are things that people can raise, right? Your result may depend on the sample you use, right? And finally, your result may depend on the estimations method used by researchers, right? You adopt fixed effects. Why not dynamics or instrumental variable techniques, right? You adopt GMM, right? Why not least square dummy variable corrected, right? You adopt basically you estimate the long run equation using dynamic OLS. Why not fully modify OLS or very simple static OLS? So different estimation methods, different approach may give you a different result. And people might ask you if you just present one estimations methods. So these are many different ways that you can think of. And if you are able to look from this context, right, it's not difficult for you to come up with at least 3 robustness checks, right? And why I say 3? Because these are the minimum you should do, right? At least 3, the minimum that you should do in context of adopting robustness checks. And if you look at here, for example, how many robustness checks they have done? 5 of them. Right? And how about this? How many robustness checks they have done? As I mentioned to you, 10 of them. They just listed here only 7. They do more than this, right? But these are basically the robustness check that they have done to look at the impact of economic policy uncertainty, right? When you want to do robustness checks, right, my suggestion would be at least 3. I've seen someone do only 2 robustness checks, but then that one will not give quite strong checks of your baseline results. I would suggest you 3 and more, but then you have to think of, or as I said, either you now the critique of your own works, right? You have to wear different hats, look at your own work critically, or you put yourself in the shoes of others, right? And let people and ask, right? And challenge the baseline results, right? Or better yet, right? Once you get the baseline results, for example, give someone to read and let them criticize, right? They may ask you in a very unexpected way, which means you have not expected to do this thing before. They may raise because they may read somewhere else, right? Because they may have different knowledge than you, so they can give you basically some suggestion that need to be made. So that what you have to do, right? How would you or others challenge the baseline model and results in terms of conducting robustness checks, right? Now, as I mentioned to you, I will go one by one, right? I will go one by one. In terms of the results, right? In terms of the results, or how to do, in terms of how to do robustness checks, right? Starting from specifications, measurements, samples, estimation methods, right? Now, in terms of specifications, right? Normally there are three in the context of specifications, right? When it comes to specification, there are three things, right? Now, the first ones, which independent variables, right, should be included, right? Which independent variables should be included? Very important, right? Because when we take a look at the result that has been presented here, for example, right, there are difference by the independent variables, right? But they use this one as the first baseline results, right? So the first one, which independent variables, control variables should be included. Now, in this context, right, what I would like to suggest you to do, basically, when you read the regressions, sorry, when you read the regressions, right? So, sorry, when you read the studies, the existing study, for example, right? Try to books notes, right? For example, you have study number one, so you read 10 of them. You don't have to read a lot, right? 10 will be enough. One, right? You read number one, number two, right? You read number one, number two, number three, number four, up to number 10, right? Now, what you have to do when you read them, for example, try to look at what are the main variables, right? Main independent variables that are common across these 10, right? And then what are the variables that are not common across those 10? They are not common. So what you try to find out here is that you want to build a very basics models, right? Where in the first model, you include only your key variables and the variables that are common, normally included, right? That are common, that normally included in the models, right? And from that ones, then you have some other independent variable that you may want to add in later on, set by set or one by one, right? So those are things that basically you may want to look at, right, when you read the literature. Why? Because this will give you some idea which variables that must and always be in the regressions, which variable can be added and can be dropped from the regressions. Why you want to do this thing? Because you can construct your first table with different set of independent variables, right? And as I give you the example before, you can learn from that too, right? You can start with simple bivariate regressions where you have only your dependence and your key independent variable, and you start adding other variable set by set, and you try to see and you table them in the regressions, right? So these are independent variables that should be included. You have to look at those, right? And statistical assumptions, right? What assumption that you make when you adopt fixed effect model, for example, right? How you justify those, right? And the most important assumption that we make, as I mentioned before, the exogeneity and endogeneity assumptions, right? Remember, you run the regressions, right? You run the regressions. This is your regressions, y, alpha, plus beta x, and plus some other variable. Your assumption is that x is exogenous, right? If you relax that assumptions, what might happen? Because these are the way you specify the models by putting the assumption in. And that's why in the building the models, whichever model that you use, you must be aware of the assumptions that has been made, right? You must be aware of the assumption that has been made, because those assumptions are made so that you can get unbiased estimate, right? So that's one really important tool. And these are required to learn econometrics. If you want to apply econometrics, required to learn econometrics. The same thing with SEM, they must have assumptions. And the way you estimate, right, would depends on the assumptions. And if the assumptions are right, your estimate are valid. If the assumptions are not right, right, then it may affect the property of your estimate. It can be biased, it can be inconsistent, right? A lot of things can be, right? It can be biased, it can be inconsistent, and so on, right? So you have to be aware of the assumption that you make, whatever model that you use. Right? For example, if you use, some of you are going to use GMM, you have to be aware of the fact that when you use GMM, the key assumptions of the GMM estimation method of dynamic panel is that the instruments that you use, right, instruments, right, that you use are valid instruments. And there exist no autocorrelations in the original models. And that's the main assumption for you to get what? Consistent estimate of beta, right? If you have time series, again, all kinds of assumptions coming in, like no structural breaks, right? Which means there is no shift in the parameters. So you have to be aware of those assumptions, because later on, maybe you yourself want to criticize that assumptions. And once you criticize that assumption, you can come up with different way of doing things. And that different way of doing things become your robustness checks. Right? Become your robustness checks. So that's very important part that you have to look at. Right? So that's why when it comes to results, it ties directly to understanding econometrics. Right? So you must have knowledge of econometrics. Right? Now, when you learn econometrics, do not just learn the software. Very important, because many of us, especially the young one, they learn econometrics, they learn on how to do this and that using the software, but they do not understand something behind it, right? Something that underlies the models, the assumptions, the theories behind them. You have to understand that assumptions, right? I cannot go into details, right? But of course, when you come up with the articles, right? When we go to the enhancement later on, I can tell you maybe certain problem in the assumption that you have made, right? Because these are very specific to the model when it comes to the assumptions, right? And sometimes your specification also in terms of the functions. Our standard here, what we have done so far, and including the example that I give you before, right? The standard model specification is linear regressions, right? Linear regressions, okay? But then let's say, for example, your objective is to look at nonlinear relationships between X and Y, right? And then in order to link X and Y in a nonlinear fashions, out there are so many different ways, right? There are so many different ways of incorporating non-linearity, right, in the models, right? For example, you think that, let's say, you believe that, let's say the level of competition, for example, in the banking sector, at the lower levels, as bank competition increase, it will benefit bank. But once competition become more fierce, become more competitive at the higher level, it may affect bank negatively, right? Which means that you foresee that there are non-linear relation between the two, right? So in that context, you may add in quadratic terms in your regressions, but adding quadratic term is not the only way to capture non-linearity or non-linear relation between the variable. There are so many different ways. If you use time series, you have switching regressions or threshold regressions, right? So you have all kind of way in order to use non-linearity, right? But then, as I mentioned, the baseline have to start somewhere, right? Start with one, but then you have to think of different way of addressing the same objective. And if you can think of those, that different way can be part of your robustness checks, right? Now, if you ask my preference, right? My preference very simple, sir, in most of the work that I have done, right? And of course, your preference might be different, but then you can take a look at many other articles that have been done. My preference would be my first result that I have, right? My first result that I have, I will present my first results estimating many regressions, and those many regressions, right, are differentiated by this, right? So what I try to say here, I follow exactly the article that I have given you as example, right? Article in applied economics, article in economic modeling. That would be my first tables, and I will call that table baseline regressions, right? Baseline regressions. So which means that I present them, right? Many, right? At least 3, right? You don't have to go 10, for example, 3 or 4, but then there are differences in the context of the independent variable that are included in the models. You have your key variables, you have different independent variables, and how to put in that independent variables, you can take a look at the articles in the same area. You can get some guidance from there, right? Because normally we put a set of variables together, like in the context of the first article there, right? They put first bank specific variables, and then they put macro variables, and they put them together. We can do exactly the same thing, right? In what we have done, we put our core variable first, which means the key variable that we try to look at, and we put the control variable that are common that we have observed in many articles, and then the third and fourth one, we add some other set of variables, and the last one, we add every variables in there, right? So this would be my first, and that my normal preference, because it's quite natural, quite easy to do that, right? So that's why my preference is to start the baseline model with few regressions, differentiated by set of control variables. And that's what I normally do, right? If I run the regression, of course, there are many different ways, as I mentioned, right? You can start your first table with your objective. Maybe you have 3 objectives. So first table, regression number 1 for the first objective, regression number 2, second objective, regression number 3, the third objective. You can do in that way also, right? But what I try to bring into the table here, try to strategize, right? And as I mentioned, my preference in terms of this case to look at the independent variables, right? And that's my first table. And then I would discuss my first tables, right? I would discuss my first tables. And I will discuss that first table will be discussed in details, especially in the context of the hypothesis that I would like to address. Right? In details means that not only the interpretations of the coefficient that I have estimated, which we have discussed in the last workshop, but also try to link back with existing findings. So which means try to link my finding with the literature review that I have done, and try to explain from the theoretical point of view, and try to provide recommendations based on those results. So very detailed I will discuss. I will give you later on the structure of the discussions, right? For the first table that I have done, right? And then I have to jot down, right? I have done this. It's my first table, right? These are, let's say, my first table. Now, in this context, I have to ask, for example, can I relax certain assumptions, right? Because I made assumptions in my early models. Can I relax the assumptions? Like in the second article, they relax assumption of exogeneity, which means they allow endogeneity. Of course, when you relax the assumptions, maybe you have to estimate using a different estimation methods, right? So that's basically what you have to ask yourself. Critically assess, right? list down first what might be a different way that you can do things on the basis of model specifications. Right? As I mentioned, when it comes to model specifications, there are three different things. The independent variable you put in, statistical assumption you put in, that you make, and the function that you use to link the variables together. And if we start our first table with this, for example, then I can ask myself, assumptions, let's look at assumptions, right? Can I, if all my assumptions are right, then it's okay. But let's say if my assumptions are not so right, or in the context of the model that I use, right? And when the assumptions are right, the estimation method may not be the best one, for example, or may not be the optimal one, the better one. Is there any other estimation method, which is point number 4 that we'll discuss later on? So you have to ask yourself, in terms of this case, because you look at different papers may employ different assumptions. They may use different functions, right? Do you have that or not in the context of what you do, right? For robustness checks, right? You have to list that down first, right? In context of statistical assumptions and the functions that you use. A very important part, right? In terms of this case. Okay. Now, I will discuss one by one, but then if, for example, if, for example, anyone have anything to ask, right? When I go one by one, please jump in and you can type too, and then you can not only type, but also you can stop me and then ask me. Right? Is there anyone have anything to ask in this context? It can be something related to your work, right? Or some things that you would like to know as part of understanding of what I have described here. Or if what I explained is not so clear to you, you can ask, right? Anyone?
Anyone to ask a question to Prof. Mansur?
Okay. If not, okay, we continue, but I'm for sure you have something to ask because I have read your methods, right? And you set down your method and you have not taught yet in your methods, right? Someone's talking there. Anyone? Okay. Yeah, no, no one is there. Okay. So if not, let me continue, right? Now, the second one that you have to look at basically the measurements, right? Very important, right? If you look at one of article that you use here, right? For examples, right? Here, they use alternative measurements, right? Very important part, alternative measurements, which means that you have your key variables that you try to look at, but because out there are many different ways of measuring things. It's not only one way to measure things, right? So you have to look at the measurements also, which can be used as part of robustness checks. Right? Now, in fact, if you do this thing, for examples, right, it will sometimes we know we have data, right? And before you collect data, it's good to do this also because you will know exactly what type of data that need to be collected, especially when it comes to measurements of the variables. Very important, the measurements of the variables. I can give you all kinds of macro variables that have different measures to capture, that have different components in it. Right? I can discuss in more detail. So let's take a look at the measurements. Now, when it comes to measurements, there are two, right? The very important part that you have to understand, what concern is not the measurements of control variable, but the measurements of your key variables, right? Because the one that you have to focus when you do your work, right? You have to remember one thing, the one that you have to focus when you do your work, right, is your hypothesis, your objective, right? And your hypothesis, your objective is reflected in the key variables that you use. And these key variables are two, the dependent variables and your focus, the independent variables, not the control variables, but your key independent variables. A very simple example again, sorry for repeating this, but this is so clear. Digital financial inclusions and economic growth. The dependent variable would be economic growth. The independent variable would be digital financial inclusions. Because that article had many other independent variables, but that's not the focus. That's just the control variable. You don't have to look at that. The one that you have to look at when it comes to measurement is the key variables. Right? So you have to think of your dependent variable to use and ask yourself, are there alternative ways of measuring the dependent variables? Are there many different ways, right, of measuring the dependent variables? Right? Look at how the existing literature define dependent variables. In that way, you can get some idea. Right? You look at, for example, the one that looked at bank risk. Right? Some article use non-performing loans. Some article use loan loss provisions. Some article use Z score. Some article use all of them. Some article look at components of Z score, which is divide components of Z score into risk-adjusted profitability and risk-adjusted capitalizations of the banks. Right? So there are so many different ways. And of course, when you try to start your regressions, let's say I would like to look at bank risk, right? Try to see how the interest rate affect bank risk, for example, in a dual banking system. You may start with NPL or you may start with Z score, right? You may start, but then you keep at the back of your mind, maybe NPL I can use for robustness checks. Or if I don't have enough data on NPL, I can use loan loss provisions, or I can use loan loss reserve, for example, right? Or I may use the components as robustness checks so that I can know which elements of Z score will be affected more, right? So these are types that you have to look at. In fact, there are so many ways of measuring the dependent variable. If you look at income inequality, for example, inequality, if you do this thing, and if you use, for example, country level data, right? You know for sure that there are so many income inequality measures, right? One of them coming from UTIPS, right? University of Texas, UNIDO database, right? One's coming from World's Income Inequality Database. One coming from Standardized World Income Inequality Database. So there are so many databases out there. And within this, there are gross income inequality, right? And there are net income inequality, right? If your dependent variable income distribution, you are so much interested. Why? Because with the COVID that we have, we are so concerned about income inequality. So we have to identify what affects income inequality and how much the pandemic have resulted in widening income distributions across different peoples. And you would like to look at those things and how Islamic Bank or how our system can come into play. Let's say these are your objectives, for example. But then you get these country level data and try to look at various components and so on. Right? You look at that too. You have to start with one, right? The other maybe you put the list. I may do robustness checks based on net income, for example. Right? Some study they use this, but they do robustness checks based on WIID. Right? So these are basically various way of looking at robustness checks. And this way that I'm suggesting to you now is to look at the measurements of key variable that you look at, dependent variables, right? So very important too, right? In terms of looking at dependent variables as part of robustness checks, right? Always ask yourself, basically, are there alternative way. So this one really important of measuring the dependent variables, because if you look at, for example, right, you look at one study that has been done looking at the impact of Islamic finance on financial market developments. Okay? And we know that financial market development in literature has been measured in many different ways. One is based on financial size or financial debt. They look at credit to GDP ratio, right? And the other one, they look at a more broader case, bank liquidity to bank liquid asset to GDP ratio. So these are many different ways that people have done in terms of basically measuring the dependent variable, and you have to keep in mind on that, right? So that's why I say literature review very important for you too, and that's why you have to when you read literature, you have to take notes on all these different aspects, because later on they will help you in terms of strategizing robustness checks, right? So you have to look at whether there exists alternative ways of measuring the dependent variables, right? If you take a survey data, for example, I would say this one important too. How you capture intentions. There may be many different ways based on many different questions that you ask, for example, right? So if you are able to come up with 2 or 3 different ways, and that can serve as robustness checks of your work, right? Very important. And that's why designing the methods as well as looking ahead for the result, for example, on how to present them, they come together. They come together. And that's what need to be done by researchers. Because I do not want to publish my work, but then my work depends on the dependent variable that I use, right? Someone coming up and use different dependent variable and get totally different results, right? Or someone else out there believes that there are better measure of the dependent variables, and then very difficult for me to get accepted, for example, in the journal. So these are type of things that you have to look at. Are there alternative ways of measuring the dependent variables? And the same thing, we have to look at, are there alternative ways of measuring independent variables? The focus one, the one that you focus, right? I give you financial inclusions. How to measure financial inclusions, right? You look at the literature, for example, they start with very simple measure of financial inclusion. They look at ATM, number of ATM per 100,000 population. They look at branches, right? They look at number of adults, percentage of adults with bank accounts, right? Bank accounts, right? But then as time proceeds and on, people use, and that's why when you are interested in something, follow that topic and try to understand on how things evolve. Now people combining them together into the index, right? Using, for example, min-max method and come up with Sirma index and many other indexes that has been suggested. And now people try to divide the index into different dimensions, right? Access dimensions, usage dimensions, right? People look at outreach dimensions, people look at many different type of dimensions. Why people try to understand things, which aspect of inclusion. So you have to be aware of all those, right? The example I gave before, uncertainty. How to construct uncertainty index, right? These are things that you have to be aware of. Some people use goal uncertainty index, right? That has been constructed by Ahir et al. Some people use economic policy uncertainty index that has been constructed by Baker et al. Some people construct uncertainty on their own using simple standard deviations. Some people use a more extensive frameworks in order to measure uncertainty using GASH modeling, right? So many different ways of measuring uncertainty, right? And if you use your own GASH or your own standard deviations, what variable that you use? Some people use stock market price, stock market. Some people use exchange rate. Some people use CPI or inflation. So there are many different ways out there. So you have to look at your focus and then try to look at, are there any other different ways of constructing that uncertainty, right? Volatility, right? Now, for me, to share with you, I'm writing, as I mentioned in last workshop, I'm writing an article, and my key independent variable uncertainty. And in my baseline, I use just very simple standard deviation. Now I have to think of, is there any different way to construct uncertainty, right? And look at growth volatility. But growth volatility for me is dependent variable, not independent. But then still, I have to think of different way to construct volatility of growth, right? So that I can take a look at whether financial inclusion affect volatility of growth or not. So these are type of things that you have to look at when you try to measure the independence variables, right? Very important, right? I can give you example on and on, because measurements, right? You have a variable of interest and you use proxies, and there are many different proxies of certain variables, right? Where you have to keep in mind what proxies that you would like to adopt first due to the strength that you see in that proxy, but then you also would like to show others that if I change my proxy, my result will be more or less the same, right? So these are type of things that you need to consider, right, in the context of conducting robustness checks, right? Now, you take a look at the a lot already that you can do from here, right? First, the assumptions, right? Do you have, or are there any other people out there have different assumptions, right? Or you criticize your own assumptions and try to come up with difference or relaxation of the assumptions, right? Let's say exogeneity become endogeneity. And the second one, measurements. Just think of measurement, very important parts, right? How to measure it, and how you measure. You're dependent, you're independent. Are there many different ways of measuring that? If there are different ways of measuring, why not try to look at, if I use different measures, what would happen to my results? And that's what you mean by robustness checks, right? The reasons is that people might tell you your result depends on the measure that you use. We do not want our result to depend on the measure that we use. We want our result to not to depend. Regardless of which measure that we use, we would like to get the same conclusions, right? The result, of course, will not be exactly the same because the numbers will shift, but then we would like to arrive at exactly the same conclusions, or at least at the end of your analysis, you can come up with one or two conclusions that you are comfortable with, right? In the context of the result that you present, right? So these are basically what you need to do in the context of the key variable. Look at measurements, right? Either at the dependent variables or independent variables. So that's what you have to look at. Okay? So that second one. Yes, anyone want to ask anything?
Yeah, I have a question for participant, Prof. Mansur.
Yeah.
The question is, if in the robustness test, I make a treatment variable example in housing disaster data, we classified high, middle, and low impact for the performance of banking performance, and for robustness test, I take down the middle impact and use only high and low impact. Have I done a good robustness? Or if my analysis pass the robustness test I do, then it's correct my method, or maybe you have some suggestion?
I'm not sure when you said low impact, high impact. Can you give you
Housing disaster data?
Yeah,
high,
can you
middle,
give
and
me
low
in the
impact.
context of examples? You give
Example
example.
is housing
Yeah.
disaster for affect the banking performer, and he divide the classified the disaster about the distance, maybe distance, low distance, high, middle distance, and high distance is in covered area of disaster, and how the financing is affect that disaster. And he said after that, for robustness test, robustness, he take the middle distance minimize bias, and he only take the low distance and high distance, the near distance and the long distance, like that, Prof. Mansur.
Yeah, I know, but I try to understand what you asked in terms of this case, right?
Yeah.
Let me put in this context. Your dependent variable is what?
Dependent variable is dummy variable for housing disaster.
Dummy variable for? Dummy variable for?
For dummy variable for the impact of disaster, low, middle, and high.
Okay, so you have your dependent variable you identify as low, right? Middle, high, and how you quantify this? What number you give?
Number is one is distance, and this is housing disaster is how much the housing is destroyed.
Yeah, because I try to understand what you have mentioned. Okay. Now, but if you can type, it's okay, Danny, because I try to understand what you have said, right? But let me move on. These two that has asked, if our robustness checks comes to different results from our baseline results, are there any strategies for, right? Should we stick to our baseline result and try to find other methods of robustness checks? This is quite interesting, right?
Yes.
Second one, what should we do if our robustness check do not confirm our main results? So the same thing. Now, see, when we do our robustness checks, our objective is not to confirm our main result. Our objective is to see whether our result remain the same or not. If they are not, if they change, for example, then we have to discard accordingly, right? To discard accordingly, right? But then, if they are different, for examples, right, then we have to strategize in different way in order to basically present our results. Because the way that we try to communicate is that, right, based on the finding that we have made, our results are fragile, which means that are not supported, right? Because it's of lack of robustness checks. That robustness, that also the finding that you do, right? So normally it's not good. In fact, right, in the context of doing robustness check, we just do robustness checks and keep on doing robustness check just to get the result that confirm the baseline result. That's not a good way of doing things, right? So that's why in terms of robustness check, I always, these are very important in the context of the ethical aspect of conducting research, right? We should not do research just to confirm our hypothesis, right? We have to look at research, try to evaluate whether the hypotheses are right or not right. If they are not, for example, then we have to state as such, right? We have to state as such. But normally, right, let's say you have your baseline results, right? You do robustness check number 1. You do robustness check number 2. You do robustness check number 4. You do robustness check number 5, right? Now, let's say across all these robustness checks, right, you do not have uniform findings in the sense that in some the result supports baseline, but in others the result do not support them, right? Which means that suddenly become insignificant, for examples, right? Now, in this context, right, when you do all these things, the next thing that you have to do, how to put all these things together and make conclusions, right? because normally these are the normal situation that you face. For example, when you do a lot of analysis, you're not going to get the result that you wish to get 100%, right? If you do 5, 6 robustness checks, 4, or even 3, you get the result 100% according to the baseline. For example, there may be something fishy there, right? Your control variables remain the same, everything remain the same, and so on. There will be few changes, but that few changes very related to the key independent variables or the control variable, that different thing. But there may be some changes even at the key dependent variables, right? You have done this thing. Now, then from all these that you have done, for examples, right? All these that you have done, you have to draw conclusions. What do you learn from here, right? Majority of evidence, where it point to, right? Because you cannot say in terms of, right, they are robust, result remain the same across everything, because sometimes you get only the majority of evidence pointing toward, right? So these are type of things you have to look at. If the result totally, let's say, not supported the baseline, right? Basically, you have to tell that, and you have to make conclusions that digital financial inclusion doesn't affect economic growth. Why? Because the result is so different, right? And what has been proposed so far in the context of digital financial inclusions has been basically overemphasized. People have overemphasized the importance of financial inclusions. So these are type of things that you have to put into discussion, but that the findings, right? That the finding. Whatever finding that you get, tell them and try to explain. And of course, to come up with explanation is not something easy, right? Okay, who want to raise hand? Yes.
Please, Mr. Purwanto, to raise hand.
Ya, Assalamualaikum, Prof.
Waalaikumsalam.
Yeah.
Yes, Purwanto.
Okay, actually, I'm interested about your explanation, Prof. Okay, I have some, maybe 2 questions. Yeah.
Sure.
Number 1, about classical assumption test. Classical assumption test.
What test?
Sorry, I will
Assumption. Assumption
classical
test.
assumption test, Prof. Classical assumption test.
Yeah.
If and then I use like the data panel data, and then classical assumption test just maybe normality, and then heteroscedasticity and multicollinearity, or also we must check the all classical assumption test like linearity, and then like autocorrelation.
Okay.
This is number 1. The second question is if and then we use the secondary data, and then sometimes difficult to check about class or pass classical assumption test. Maybe multicollinearity maybe not fulfill the requirement and so on. Is it possible? Okay. Is it possible if some of data maybe in one period is we delete or excluded, and then is it possible if the data is unbalanced actually, because maybe 10 years, maybe 1 year is not good data, maybe extreme data. Now, is it possible this data can excluded? Now, the impact is the data is unbalanced. Now, is it possible, Prof, to check to analysis in this multivariate or regression, Prof? Okay, thank you, Prof.
Okay, these are as I mentioned to you, basically when it comes to testing of the assumptions, right, you have to know the assumptions made in the models, right? Made in the model. So let me share with you a little bit, right, in the context of the testing, right? By going through the models, right? The classic assumption test. Now, we look at there are so many different type of framework out there, right? And when we learn econometric, for example, the first thing that we learn is classical regressions, regardless of what type of data that you use. You have classical regressions, where you have your dependent variable y, right, and alpha. These are very basic rudimentary frameworks, right? You have beta 1, x1, and so on. You have everything, let's say, beta k, xk, and error2. So these are your classical models. And of course, your classical models, you make all kinds of assumptions, right? For example, you have normality assumptions, right? You have homoscedasticity, right? Or basically, to put in a word, that epsilon here is distributed as normal distributions with mean 0 and variance sigma square. And they are independent of each other, which means there's no autocorrelation and so on. So these are very basic framework. And of course, most of us will not use this basic framework because we use different type of data set, or not just cross-sectional data set. We may use time series that bring different features in, right? We may use basically the panel data that bring different features in and so on, right? But these are the assumptions that you have, of course, right? Now, and that's why I said, when you do your analysis, you have to understand the model that you use, right? For example, let's say you go to panel, you use panel data, but your panel is static panel, for example, where the time is short, right? So these are what you have to learn. And my apology to all of you. For some of you that may not be aware of this, this is just to give you example. Of course, we have to go into details and have a training on this to understand exactly every econometric modeling, right? Yeah, panel static at time series is short. And in static panels, what they normally give you is basically prior analysis before you pick up which one. You have to do prior analysis, right? Or a priori analysis of the modeling, right? Because when it comes to panels, static, for example, what we learned, there are 3 different ways of model specifications, right? In terms of panel data, right? Where whether you want to assume the individual specific effect to be commons, or to be fixed but different across countries, or to be random. So that's why you have basically pool, OLS, fixed effect, and random effect. You have to do a priori analysis in order to look at this, right? And once you perform a priori analysis, then you estimate the model according, because this a priori analysis will give you, let's say, fixed effects, right? Fixed effect, right? You do a fixed effect. Now, of course, you have to do robustness. If you look at the literature, for example, now it becomes standard. When you do fixed effect, then you don't need to do, let's say, a test of the assumption, because once you have time is short, not long, right? And you adopt fixed effect, you have cross-sectional dimensions, and most likely the variance across the section will not be the same, right? Imagine you put bank together. You have small bank, you have big bank. The variance will not be the same because there are different entities, right, of the bank. So normally people adopt it right away using robust standard errors, right? Robust standard errors. So this means that they use panel static, time is short, and robust standard errors is to take care of basically non-constant variance. But then there are other assumptions. How about endogeneity? And this is what you have to raise in, right? And sometimes you don't need to conduct the test, right? In the context of certain framework, you just need to raise issues, right? I have used robust standard errors to take into considerations of, for example, let's say, the non-constant variance, but I also do have concern of endogeneity. But when you have this concern, keep this in mind so that this one can become your robustness checks, which means that you start your baseline assuming no endogeneity problem, but then you do robustness check allowing for endogeneity problem. So you cater both cases, right? Both cases. No one can come in, you do not address this. That's why your result look the way you look at. You can tell them, look, I address both ways, right? But then my starting point is this, right? So you have to understand that's diagnostic. If you go to dynamic panel, for example, there are totally different type of diagnostic that you have to report. In dynamic panel, with time is short, normally we look at autocorrelations and we look at the instruments, right, that you use. You have to conduct those tests, right? When you use time series data, there exists a priori analysis of time series, right? What are a priori? Unit root test, co-integration test. And once you come up with your final models, you have to go through all standard diagnostic tests. So these are all type of tests that are embedded in various type of framework that you use, okay? So that's why I say when it comes to these assumptions, you have to understand what are behind the models in the context of the assumptions that you have made. Right? Because you can look at alternative assumptions, but you have to start with one first. Right? For example, as I mentioned, you can start with exogeneity assumption, but then alternative specification would be allowing for endogeneity, for examples. Right? So these are basically the more important part. Even when we estimate the time series regression, the long run equation in time series, for example, right? If we use static panel, if we use static OLS, simple OLS to estimate the long run equation, right? You consider the X to be exogenous. But in order to allow endogeneity, you may need to use dynamic OLS, for example, right? So these are many different ways to look at things. And the detail is so specific with different type of models, it's quite difficult for me to come up with the general guideline, right? But you have to understand the fact that for every model, because if you look, these are I would say these are basically the step that you go through, right? You get specifications, model specifications, right? You have to specify your model, what model that you use. And this again would depend on data set, depend on your hypothesis, depend on the objective that you have, depend on a lot of things. And when you have models, and you have to understand that all models that you have come up with assumptions that you have made, right? Either classical assumptions or many other assumptions that you have added in. And based on those, you estimate the models, right? Estimate the models, right? And in some modeling, it requires you to report diagnostics, right? But in some articles, they do not report diagnostic, but then they go directly to robustness check in the sense that, okay, I make these assumptions. I would like to relax this assumption. As I mentioned, the common one, I make the assumption of exogeneity. I would like to relax and make it endogeneity. In this case, you don't have to go to diagnostic, try to see whether the variable endogenous or not, right? You can just go and allowing for that to capture the second conditions, right? Where the variables are endogenous. So these are many different ways that we can do things. But we, as I mentioned here, we have to understand the models that we use. And I'm not going to be able to give you general guideline, but basically, if I would say in a general way, be aware of the assumptions and ask yourself, can you relax the assumptions? Right? Are your assumptions valid on the theoretical grounds? Because sometimes you don't need to do diagnostic tests. As I mentioned to you before, when it comes to the fixed effect, for example, I don't need to basically, when it comes to fixed effect, I don't need to run heteroscedastic tests. If I use panel data, I just incorporate right away robust standard errors, because that's the standard one that people have used to tackle or to address potential non-constant variance. So that's what we have in the context of the model. And all these things become more technical when we go to the methods. Right? My apology, become more technical, but then that's what you need to understand, because it will help you in the context of robustness checks, right? Okay, would you give explanation again to variable dummy? Okay, this one says.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Yeah, your
Yeah,
explanation. Thank you, Prof. Yeah.
Hopefully I can answer. Okay, let me, this one's basically said, what is the difference between the measurement of the Z-score and t-test? Okay, now I think that there exists confusions here in the context of Z and t-test, right? Because the Z-score that I mentioned here, there are different concepts of Z-score, right? Of Z's, you look at literature. Right? The one when you say Z, this one is related to the standard normal distributions, right? Standard normal distributions, where you get the Z test statistics. Sometimes people also call Z score. These are just for hypothesis testing, right? The one that I refer to in the context of measuring, right? Measuring bank stability is not the Z test there, right? Measuring bank stability, because in order to measure bank stability, people look at how the distance, right, of, right, the distance from being insolvent, right? So which reflect how much capital must be depleted before bank become insolvent, and that the measure of Z score. And this is measured by basically return on assets plus, right, equity to asset ratio divided by standard deviations on return on assets, right? So these are one measure of Z score, and this represents roughly stability of the banking system, not the Z score that you refer to, right? Because this Z test is T test. These are the test statistics, but the Z score that I refer to in my presentation is this. And of course, there are one more Z score that has been used for the purpose of forecasting financial distress that people call Ullmann Z score, right? And this is based on the construct of certain key variable with certain weightage. They have X1, X2, X3, and they construct the index and they give the weightage for the X score. So that totally different things, right? With respect to the Z score and so on, right? So that's basically the one opens, right? And this one's, yeah, Ullmann Z, true, right? Would you give explanations again for variable dummy at data panel methodology? I'm not sure if this dummy is dummy for the independent variables or dummy for dependent variables, right? So I'm not sure, but if based on my discussion last week, I would say would be dummy for independent variables, right? No, we have dummy variable, for example, and we use a lot in Islamic banking and Islamic finance research, right? Because normally we try to make comparisons as part of one objective. Very simple way, for example, we would like to know whether Islamic banks are more profitable than conventional banks. And we would like to know whether investments in Islamic equities give you higher return as compared to conventional equities. So those are things that we would like to know based on the hypothesis that we have. Now, how to measure those difference? We use dummy variables, right? So which means that in our data set, we specify one variable, let's say Islamic banking dummy. We make Islamic banking to be equal to 1 if the bank is Islamic, right? The bank is Islamic, right? And equal to 0 if they are not, which means they are conventional banks. So we specify this variable based on the category of the bank. And there are so many dummy variables out there, foreign bank, domestic bank, for example, right? And sometimes low income countries, high income countries, people put dummy variable in there. So there are some crisis and non-crisis years, also dummy variables, right? And sometimes these dummy variables are very important because they affect the results. For example, Islamic bank may have different level of profitability. Islamic bank may have different level of risk. So let's say you run this regression, you put risk of bank I at time t, and then you run alpha plus beta 1, and you put Islamic Bank or Bank I, whether the bank is Islamic bank or not, and then you put in other variables, right? This beta 1 here will capture the difference in risk between Islamic bank and conventional bank, holding everything else to be constant, right? All other to be equals. So which means that if beta 1 more than 0 and significance, we can say that controlling for other factors to be constant, Islamic bank is more risky as compared to conventional bank. And if this risk represented by non-performing loan, beta 1 provide you the difference in non-performing loan between Islamic bank and conventional bank, right? Which means that holding other variable to be constant, the NPLs of Islamic bank is higher than conventional bank by beta 1. If beta 1 is less than 0 and significant, right? Islamic bank is less risky, right? And having NPL lower than conventional bank by how much? By this, beta 1. If beta 1 is not significant, it means that there is no difference in the risk, right, of Islamic bank and conventional bank that had the same controls, which means that everything else remain constant. So if you take two bank, one Islamic, one conventional, that have the same control variables, the same size, the same capitalizations, right? The same profitability level, whatever you have control for. If this is not significant, then they have no difference in the risk of the bank. So those are the way that we interpret the dummy variable, the one that we have discussed last week. And of course, we also have interactive dummy that you have to go back to what we have discussed last week and try to look at on how we interpret the results, right? So that's the dummy variables, right? I will answer one more and then we go for the break first before we come back and continue, right? If I want to confirm if there exists, right, the alternative measure of our key variable to check robustness, what should we do? Should we also regress the model using the alternative measure? Thank you, right? The answer, you have to look at that one would be quite one potential, right? For example, I give you this, right? The one that I mentioned to you before. I'm trying to look at how financial inclusions, these are my topic, or let's say, yeah, I try to look at how financial inclusions affect output volatility, right? Output volatility, right? Now, when I look at literature, this is what I found out, right? People use GDP per capita growth or GDP per capita growth, right? Let's say GDP growth over 3 years and compute standard deviations, right? I found this one out, right? And then I also found out that also people use exactly the same thing, GDP growth, but using 5 years, right? And using standard deviations. Yeah. I also found out that people use some other variable to reflect macro stability, right? Let's say instead of output, you want to look at macro stability. Right? I also found out that people use inflation's volatility, where inflation volatility estimated again using standard deviations. I also found out that people use cycles, right? They extract the cycles using HP And from this, they construct volatility. So there are many different ways constructing volatility. Right? I use this one, right? I use this one, but of course, these are all potential that I should consider, right? So that I know for sure that my result is not driven by the measure that I use, right? And that's why I said, if there exists an alternative measure of your key variables, right? What should you do, right? What should you do? You repeat the same thing as what you have done in your robustness checks, right? Repeat the same thing, but you use that different measure and try to see whether the conclusion remain the same or not. And that can be your potential robustness checks, right? So what I try to bring you here, try to list down first what are potential robustness check that I can do in my regression, so that at the end, I should perform some robustness check to show that my results remain or my result change as a result of using, let's say, the different measures of the key variables, right? So that's what needs to be done. And because these are quite common, because because out there people make argument which one is better, which one is not better in terms of measurements. You do not want to go into that debate. You want to show that regardless of whatever you use this, you use that, my result is this. But if your result different, then you have to explain why. Okay? So that basically I'm not going to say the risk, but then that's the one that we need to do. Subject our result to different ways of doing things and try to assess how good our result, how robust our result are. So that's very important part in terms of robustness checks, right? And hopefully I answered the second one there, right? You have alternative measure your key variables, right? Use the one that you want to start with first, and that alternative measure you use for robustness check. How do you do? Run the models again, repeating your baseline model, but with different measure. And that's what you have to do, right? For your robustness checks. Okay, let me stop here. Danny, can we take a break, 15 minutes?
Okay, we take a 15-minute break for the next session, strategize robustness test. Maybe next session, participant can show us the research model and research to be able to get possible or appropriate robustness input from measure. Yeah.
Okay, so we take 15 minutes.
Takes 15 minutes. Yeah.
My time is
10:15.
Yeah, so we 10:30 we come back. Okay.
10:30. Yeah. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Those are type of thing that you have to ask yourself too, right? So I cannot say whether these are enough in terms of robustness check or not. You have to ask yourself many different ways that people might ask you, right? Might throw away your result, for example, in what way? So that's what you have to think hard, right? And all these are based on splitting the samples, right? Is there any other way samples that you can basically do robustness check? That you have to ask yourself, right? In terms of robustness checks. Okay, so these are basically the way we, as I mentioned, conduct robustness check. And I give you two examples here when we look at our papers, right? And then the one that asks whether splitting sample, now you start thinking, this is a good point, because now you start thinking, right? You start thinking, oh, these are the way that we can do things, right? And keep on thinking, because when you think and you try to do different ways, you may come up with innovative way to do robustness checks, not just the one that I just suggested to you here, right? So keep on thinking. That's good response that you have give you, right? What kind of estimation method we can use is our baseline model static panel, right? Of course, when you have static panel regressions, remember in static panel regressions, there are given the assumptions. Let's say if in static panel regressions, right? These are methods. If you can assume that your independent variable is exogenous, you can use pool OLS. You can use fixed effects. You can use random effects. But then within this static panel, right, you can conduct a test to choose between pool OLS and these two, which one to choose. For example, you can use the Lagrangian multiplier test, LM test, right, to choose between those two. To choose between these two, you can use Hausman test. So within a static panel, they provide you a way of choosing which one. But these are three different ways, right? Normally, people use fixed effects, normally. But some studies use random effect because fixed effects cannot address the presence of dummy variables. Let's say you have Islamic bank dummy, for example, and Islamic bank dummy remain the same across years. You cannot use fixed effect. In that context, you may need to use random effect. So these are three different ways of estimating static panel. But then, for example, for robustness checks, you may want to relax assumptions of exogeneity, endogeneity, for example. When you assume endogeneity, then you have to go to instrumental variable-based estimation techniques. And that's what you have to do, right? Or you have to do Hausman-Taylor, for example. So there are many different ways of addressing. So that's why I don't want to go into the method. There are so many different methods available out there. But if you have static panel, these are the normal one that people use for estimating static panels. Okay. Question rolling in. Right? Okay.
Prof. Mansur, tadi Prof. Tika, raise hand.
Okay.
Prof. Tika, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Prof. Prof, very sorry, I have a meeting in the middle of your session about an hour, Prof. So I'm very sorry if you already addressed this in your session before. I remember one time you said, do not put everything in one paper. So in my case, I want to study about whether a social functions of Islamic bank, such as zakat and also wakaf and micro financing that is given through Islamic bank, has an impact to increase the financial inclusion in Indonesia. So we use a Sharma dimension to represent the financial inclusion with several adjustments on the dimension. Now the thing is, we use different unit analysis, Prof, which leads to different data set. So in the first model, we use the national level data. We use Islamic banking data. And the second is on regional level. We use Islamic rural bank data. So different data set. So my question is, does it consider both of the model as a robustness check, or it can be a different paper?
If you ask me on that one, I would suggest you split into different papers because those two type of bank have different objective, right? National bank, they may have different objective, and rural bank, they may have different objective. And when you use rural bank, it's more of regional analysis, right? So the modeling, of course, will be the same, but the focus will be totally different, right? So I would say that why not splitting the samples in terms of, because the more relevant, the more that I'm interested in is rural bank, how rural bank can promote financial inclusions and so on, right? Especially Islamic rural bank, because that one, they provide more detailed analysis into the data there. So if you want to choose one, focus on rural bank, but the national data set can be done if you want to put in terms of robustness check. But then when you use national bank, for example, then totally different sample already, right?
Yeah.
And unlike what has been done there, they use the same sample. The only thing, they aggregate the data. They use bank level data and then they aggregate into country level data. So it's still the same level, but for your case, you have rural bank and then you have different type of banks, right? So
Yes.
it should be two different papers, I would say.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Prof.
Once more, Mr. Sulaiman, do you want to ask directly to Prof. Mansur before you raise hand?
Okay, Prof, thank you for your feedback.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a question. I found that DFI, digital financial inclusion, construct by both from traditional and also construct indicator from digitalization. So I have planned to what is that, to measure or to construct the index, use both and combine both traditional and digital also. So what do you think about that?
No, I think it can be done, for example, but then you have to rename a little bit in terms of your topic, which means that you just put financial inclusions. But then your innovations or your contributions here, you enlarge your financial inclusion to include also digital dimension, which have not been done by some other work, right?
Okay.
Some other work. So basically what I try to say here, in terms of this case, right, you can do a lot of, you can do a lot with your measurement, in fact, right? You have, you can construct the aggregate financial inclusions, right? Aggregate financial inclusions, which include all dimensions, right? All dimensions that you have listed there. And then you can decompose them into two, right? The one that are of the normal one people use that you call traditional, and you have digital, for example. So which means that these three can be your baseline, for example, right? So you have your first tables, right? Let's say you have economic growth, right? Your first table there, in terms of economic growth, you can run basically the 4 regression easily. The first regressions, you use aggregate financial inclusions, AFI, right? The second regressions, you use traditional financial inclusions and control variable the same. The third regression, you use digital financial inclusions. The fourth regression, you use both traditional financial inclusions and digital financial inclusion, for example. 4, easily. And that's your baseline. Why? Because you look at the aggregate, you test separately, you put them together. 4 different things, right? And then in further robustness checks, you can divide this one further into access and usage, right? And this one also access and usage. And then you can do some other type of robustness check. So if you do this, for example, and you have data on this, for example, as I mentioned to you, these are a good way of looking at the impact, try to add more to what people have done so far, right? What people have done so far. Okay, that you can do, right? The way you construct them. So see, when you have a lot of data point, there are many different ways you can do things and try to make experimentation of all those many different ways, right? In terms of coming up with measurements, your samples, and so on. So in that way, you can see how robust your result would be. Okay.
Okay, Prof. Thank you.
Okay. Good. Hopefully, and those of you who use regression, for example, benefit, and those of you who use structure equation modeling, I really hope that you get some guidance here in the context, especially in terms of measurements, right? So that's why when we set out to do research, we have to sit down and look at how many different ways to capture intentions, how many different ways to capture religiosity, how many different ways to capture this. So when you have that different type of measurements, for example, then it will allow you to do a lot of analysis. And that one really important part in terms of the work that we do, so that we can get into Q1, Q2, because I emphasize a lot on Q1 and Q2 for a very simple reason, because when I was engaged, when I engaged in getting in being the trainer for this, the emphasis is to bring up and your understanding of what Q1, Q2 articles look like, right? Of course, in order to achieve that, we have to train ourselves from time to time, right? From time to time, okay? So these are basically the what you have to learn, right? And how to develop yourself, right? In this context, right? Okay, so that's in terms of robustness check. So let me continue. We have short time, so we have a little bit more. These are things that we have discussed so far based on the two articles. We have baseline result and we come up 1, 2, 3 quite easily from what you have done there when I see those. And these are the structure of section 4. Normally you have baseline results. You basically tell that table this present the baseline results, right? And if you have diagnostics tests, you just mention them. And then you go into details of your key variable, the one that I've discussed before. Highlight the conclusion that you can take from your baseline results. Go deeply. Discuss detail of key variable means that what is the answer to your main objective? Positive, negative, how you compare with existing results, how you explain from the critical perspective. So discuss fully in this context. And then at the end, highlight what are the findings that you get. And then you can discuss other variables in brief. And sometimes you perform additional analysis to address other objectives that you might have. So this one can be in 4.2, right? If you have them, if applicable. But then you can proceed to robustness checks. Now, when you look at robustness check, you have to discuss each robustness check in turns, which means we perform various robustness checks, right? Our first robustness check, we consider different measure of such and such, right? And then you cite reasons in the literature, for example. Others have used these measures, right? On the basis that, on the arguments of what, and so on, and you present the results. Right? And when you present the result, robustness check, try to highlight only two things. Which baseline results that are, or illustrating, which baseline results are further supported, and which baseline results are not supported, and what are new things coming up from this robustness check. Try to do those things, right? And then once you do those, and for some other variable, just mention in brief, right? Whether they are generally in line, you don't have to go into detail. Just focus on your key result that you make conclusions in your baseline results, and go to the second one and go to the third one, right? And there's no need to go into detail as what you have done in 4.1, right? You just need to mention whether your results supported if there exist deviations, what are deviations, so that at the end of all robustness check, you sum up them together, your general conclusions from the result that you get. So these are basically normally the structure of your robustness checks, right? So these are the final thing that I would like to inform you. Right? So a lot of things that we need to do, in terms of this case, right? That we need to do for this, right? And it's very important, right? That we take it seriously, so that our papers, see, it's okay to spend 8 months, 1 year on one article, right? Because at the end, through reading, through investigating, through compiling, we are going to learn something. And we are going to convey new results, or we are going to basically share our learning with all others through publications. Because with robustness checks, our article will be more likely accepted, right? More likely accepted, right? Don't fall into, I would like to mention, don't fall into the trap of having too many articles in 1 year, but those many articles is in low class journals. Don't fall into that trap. You have to be in good journals, right? And that one very important part that you need to pay attention to, right? So I will stop here. Now our times is roughly 12:55. So I'm not sure how long do we have for Q&A, but then I will be happy to answer the Q&A sessions.
Okay, another question for Prof. Mansur. We have 15 minutes again.
Yeah.
Yeah, excuse me, Prof. I would like to follow up your recommendation for our research model. You recommend us to include macro variables in our research model. Maybe we would like to know why should we also include the macro variables in our research model, Prof? Thank you, Prof.
No, because you look at banking studies, for example, right? You can pick up any banking studies out there. They always include macro variables. The basic only two variables, GDP growth and inflations. That the very minimum that they have done, right? In terms of macro variables for the bank level studies, right? The bank level studies. Now, if you look in terms of this case, for example, let me share with you the one that I just say the loan portfolio of bank, for example, in terms of housing market. Let's take a look at in the context of this article. You look at any article there, you have to control for macro environments, because the impact of you have to control for that, because macro variables also can affect firm behavior. If you're not control for those, for example, then there might be basically problems in terms of model specifications. Right? So those are that you have to look at. Now, if you look at here, always put macro variables. You look at, they put GDP growth, they put inflation rate. These are the least that you can do. Right? Macro variable, because business cycle affect performance. Business cycle affect lending, and business cycle can be basically controlled by using, or can be predicted by using GDP growth. And macro uncertainty, like inflation, for example, can affect performance. So these are basically one example that I would like to share with you. If you go to any other article, for example, right, any other article that use bank level data sets, right? For example, this one also I share with you. Look at this article, economic policy uncertainty and financial stability, for example, and they use the Z score. These are at the bank levels, right? And they have specific variables here, but they also have macro variables in there. So that's why I said here in the context of whatever you do, right, try to look at what are the common practices out there. Right? What are common practices out there? I will show you here when they perform robustness checks, for example, they do a lot of robustness check here. And one robustness check here, bank level data. These are bank level data of robustness check. And when they do bank level data, these are bank level data that they use, 914 bank, right? And they still put in GDP and inflations, the minimum, right? So see the way that they do robustness check, you control for this because you want to see whether the main result are there or not. So why you use this one? Literature have a lot. I think in all banking literature, almost 90% that have read, they never exclude GDP growth and inflations. At least those two, right? That's why I basically suggest that you have to include those in your model specifications.
Thank you very much, Prof. We'll try to include it. Please include it.
Any others? Now, how do you see so far the training? Difficult to follow, or you understand the training but difficult to do to reach that levels of rigor, right? Or of intensiveness of analysis, right? Of course, you have to put high bar. Right? That's why people say dream big and try to do as much as possible to reach at that level, so that at least when you get, you're not far off from that highest levels. Right? Because the idea, you want to be able to publish in good journals, because it's not about the, see, publication in journal is not the end, but then when you publish in good journal, your knowledge will be disseminated more wider to those who read. Because most people read good journals, because I do not read basically non-index journal. I never cite non-index journal, for example, right? I read journals that are good, published by well-known institutions, let's say Journal from Bank Indonesia. I read them. Why? Because reputable institutions, for example. I don't read journal that I do not know where it's come from, right? So most people read good journals, and you want, and policymakers read good journals, and you want your ideas, your knowledge to go to them, right? And that's why I say you have to have rigor so that you can be in that journals.
Maybe some selected participant can give opinion about our session, how hard or how high level.
Yeah, now you are at the stage to put everything together and come up with articles, safe conclusions, and abstract, which we are going to discuss next. But that was conclusion, abstract is small thing only. The main parts we have done, right? And now we are ready. I'm not sure how many months EKS will give you. Basically, we'll give you times to come up with first draft of the articles, right? But your task number 4 would be, you have to explain, you don't have to write, explain, these are my baseline results. These are my models. Whatever model you use, like SEM or whatever that you have used there. And these are my baseline tables, look like this. Explain a little bit and give me at least 3 robustness checks that you are able to do. And then I will give feedback to you soon as possible in contact robustness checks. And if you can give me by the now 18, right? Because this is not just, it's not about writing the whole thing, just to sit down and try to think of what are potential robustness check that you can perform and why you want to, why that robustness check is needed. For example, I will give you up until the 1st of November, right? Because we are going to have our sessions, I think early November so that I can incorporate and give you feedback in terms of robustness check that you need to do. Right.
Right. Okay. Any other question? Or do you want to ask something about your tax until 1 November?
Mas Denny, just
Yeah.
want to make a small comment on that, Prof. I think apart
Okay.
from, yes, this is Tika. I think apart from writing parts, econometrics also a challenge part for me, especially Prof. So, you know, sometimes when we run the data and you know, we are lacking of knowledge on econometrics part, that's also, I think we need some you need to study about that as well, Prof.
Yeah.
Just to comment on that.
Yeah, but that one would be in different workshops, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we have the data set, we have the topics, but you know, whenever it goes to the a reviewer, you know, they must have a specific comments on econometrics part. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
They will comment on that, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other?
No, don't feel this one difficult. Just put yourself, work hard, and so on. Because I think if you keep on continuing working, it will make it easy, right? Because if you look at me, for example, I have done this for 20 years. When I see your models, I can visualize what should I do in terms of robustness checks, and you will arrive at the same place. And in fact, with all the guidance that you have and with commitment from in EKS to provide support to you, I think you will arrive at that place faster, right? But then these are what we do in the context of developing ourselves to be a good researcher. Because good researcher is not just doing things and get published. Good researcher is being rigor, always asking ourselves whether there are different. We are not going to wait for perfections. Right? No way you can wait for perfections. If you try to get perfections and ideals point, then you will never get an articles, right? But then you try to minimize certain weaknesses that you might have, or certain loopholes that people might criticize your work, right? So that's what you try to do here. Okay. No more. Yes, Denny? Anyone else? I think Denny freeze, right? So now we lost him.
Mr. Lenny is back, Prof.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yes, no, please.
Thank you for.
Okay, he freeze again.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you, Prof. Mansur. Any other question? If not, we will close this session. My connection is okay. Okay. Ada chat? Oh no. Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. Mansur Ibrahim. This is amazing insight for our paper. We know a little about the robustness test. This is a very great impact for us. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our participants, I thank you very much for your participation in this research workshop. I hope you get a lot of input. See you in the next research workshop session. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yeah.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Yeah.
wabarakatuh.
Now all of you try to focus on estimation of results, right? And I think if you have any question, we have group, right? So WhatsApp group, just post in WhatsApp groups. I will try to answer as much as I can, right? But then we don't see activity in the WhatsApp groups. Please post in WhatsApp groups. The WhatsApp group only to make announcement, but no question from you, right? So make use of those, right? In WhatsApp groups so that we can discuss further, extend our discussions, and that's the reason we have WhatsApp group. If you have anything to ask, okay?
Inshallah.
Okay, thanks to all of you and all the best, and stay safe.
Prof.
Okay.
Mansur. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, thank you.
Jazakumullah khairan kathiran, Prof. Mansur.
Thank you, Prof.
Keep healthy, Prof. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
We'll finish the Zoom ya, Prof, and all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Pak Mansur, terima kasih sekali Pak Mansur.
Sama-sama.